If you would have asked me 5 years ago what the on-trend brewing thing would be in 2021, I never would have guessed that hard seltzer water would be so popular. Laugh all you want, but hard seltzer is a fantastic day drinker and likely isn't going anywhere in the near future. Imperial Yeast's new seasonal strain, W04 Paramount, can help brewers get the most out of their seltzer fermentations. A clean and aggressive fermenter, Paramount will produce an excellent seltzer with low fusel alcohols, and it's produced in a gluten-free medium. If you've tried making seltzer with standard ale or lager strains, you know the struggle, and Imperial Yeast is here to help with W04 Paramount. Check it out at imperialyeast.com. Welcome to the Brew Lab. Before moving to the Pacific Northwest, I was more interested in malt flavor than hop flavor, but now I find myself going for IPAs when I'm at the grocery store. Perhaps it's the sheer number of IPAs I've been inundated with up here, where 95% of the U.S. hops are grown, or perhaps there is something to this hoppy aroma that people just enjoy. I'm your host, Cade, and today I'm back in the lab with my co-host, Jordan Folks, as we apply the science from last week's episode about the gas hopper.
I think that hop aroma is an incredibly important of America's favorite craft beer, IPA. And I thought this gas hopper episode was a really interesting, possibly Reinheitsgebot compliant method of getting more novel hop aroma into beer.
Yeah, that was a fun discussion talking about the Reinheitsgebot there and how we could get hop aroma into beer. But of course, this was a really cool episode just in general. I mean, it's like some basic chemistry and some basic laws of physics, and then you can get like understanding those, you come up with a system that you can get hoppy aroma into your beer without ever having to dry hop, without ever having to expose it to oxygen or put any of that hop material in there or deal with any of the other issues. Plugging your dip tube, like the feedback from 2 weeks ago's episode, we don't have to deal with any of those problems. So I thought this was a really, really cool idea. And of course, it's something that I think could work at the homebrew scale. It can work at a brewery of any size. But of course, you and I don't have experience using a gas hopper, but I think we can talk a little bit about how we would do it if we did it at home. And then, of course, let's talk about getting and keeping hop aroma in your beer, because that's actually what this is about, right? Is getting hop aroma to make those tasty IPAs that you just talked about. So we'll talk hot side and cold side strategies, and also avoiding things like cold side oxidation, or maybe even using advanced hop products that might increase shelf stability. But if you're not already a patron of Brülosophy, please consider becoming one. We really appreciate the support we get from our patrons. And of course, as a reward for your support, you get access to unpublished contributor recipes, discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invite to a monthly live Q&A session. Becoming a patron is easy. There's no obligation. You can cancel at any time. But if you're consuming all the free content that's available to you through Brülosophy, I really hope you'll consider becoming a patron. Of course, on the website, we have over 400 experiments where we test individual brewing variables by running through a triangle sensory test. There's the Short and Shoddy series, Brew It Yourself, and of course the new Brülosophy show on YouTube, and the OG podcast that got me and so many others interested in the science of brewing, the Brülosophy podcast. All this comes to you for free, and we couldn't do it without the support of our patrons. So please head over to patreon.com/Brülosophy to sign up. Another great way to support us is by using the links at brülosophy.com/support. There's, of course, some really cool affiliates over there that give us a small kickback if you purchase from their site by starting by clicking one of those Brülosophy links. It doesn't change any part of your shopping experience, but it does help us out. So head over to brülosophy.com/support to check it out. For feedback this week, Dr. Jose from Mexico writes, "Hello, Cade. I've been listening to the Brew Lab for a while now, and I really like it, mostly because I'm a physician, gynecologist, obstetrician, a biologist of human reproduction, and I own a microbrewery here in my town. I found very, very interesting the show number 3 about Philly Sour and show number 10 about brewing with non-alcoholic yeast. I want to try brewing a low-alcohol beer, so I'll follow the advice on show number 10. I have a question about pitching rate. Since you're making a low Plato wort, should you use less than normal pitching rate? What would be the grams per mil of yeast to use?" Now, episode 10 is the one where I actually talked with Brian Gibson. That was the first episode he was on. Of course, Brian Gibson was the guest from last week's episode when I talked with Philip Wheatstock and Brian Gibson about the gas hopper. And yeah, that was a long time ago. But he talked about brewing non-alcoholic beers with non-conventional yeast. So, Jordan, what do you think? Making a non-alcoholic beer, do you need to change your pitch rate?
That's a really good question. I don't really know the answer, but I would say that when he notes I guess I don't know their gender, but they note that would they use less of a normal pitching rate with a low Plato wort. But for me, my pitch rate is always adjusted to the strength. So I don't go simply on grams per liter or anything like that. I'm doing, those two and the strength based on the original gravity. So I would just use a pitch rate calculator accounting for a super low gravity, and that would give you effectively a lower pitch rate than you might use on a standard strength batch of the same volume, because it's going to downsize that based on a lower OG.
Yeah. And so this was an interesting question for me too. And I went and looked at what some of the manufacturers are recommending. So Fermentis has their LA01 strain, which is their low alcohol, non-conventional yeast strain. They say to pitch that at 50 to 80 grams per hectoliter, or around 10 to 15 grams per homebrew batch. And that's the same. So like an 11 gram packet, right? Those dry yeast packets so that you would get like in US-05. That's exactly the same for US-05. Same pitching rate. So I was thinking like, oh, well, okay, maybe you just do pitch the exact same rate. So I looked at some other yeast manufacturers, and they're all in the same range as normal beer, which I was really surprised about, because like you, I was thinking like, why do we need to pitch all this yeast if there's not very much sugar that's going to need to be fermented, right? Or respiratively consumed, depending on the yeast. The yeast might not even ferment. But in any event, I was wondering, like, do we really need to pitch that high of yeast? And I wondered, okay, well, maybe the LA01 or some of the other manufacturers are just, adjusting the amount of cells that's in their package, right? And to make the pitch rate the same, because I would think, right, if you're a brewer, you don't have to calculate, if you're using dried yeast, one of the benefits is that you just know that you put in, 500 or 50 to 80 grams per hectoliter, or, one of those packets in a homebrew pouch, and that's it. You don't have to worry about measuring your pitch rate, right? You can put 2 packets if you're brewing a lager or something. You just don't have to even think about it. That's one of the benefits of using dried yeast. And so I was wondering, maybe manufacturers are doing that. But I really don't know. Like you, Jordan, it makes a lot of sense to me that you would pitch your yeast based on the strength of the OG. I mean, looking even at like Mr. Malty's calculators for pitching, I mean, it asks you what the strength is of your wort, right? Before you pitch. Now, I think Mr. Malty and those calculators have not been updated for non-alcohol beer. So you got to take those with a grain of salt. You are pitching something that is hopefully not fermenting a lot of alcohol, or not producing a lot of alcohol into your beer. But in any event, I think this sounds like a really cool experiment, right? What if you just brewed a non-alcoholic beer, pitched a normal pitching rate, and then pitched like a low pitching rate that was based on the strength of the wort? That'd be pretty cool to see if there were any differences. Maybe we'll add that to the queue of experiments. But in any event, after this short break, we'll be back talking about how to get and keep hop aroma in your beer, and also how to use the gas hopper at home. One of the biggest improvements to my brewing practices was the upgrade to stainless steel, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which holds 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to reduce the chances of a messy blow-off, and it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brew systems out there, and their prices are remarkably affordable. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, you've got to check out deltabrewingsystems.com. We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brülosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app.
The mighty and resilient Merrimack River, carving through the communities of our great region. My name is Linda Lorden, proud president of Merrimack County Savings Bank. And like the river that serves as our namesake, we're a constant yet ever-changing presence. Because to us, it's bigger than banking. It's about powering communities and putting people first. It's about knowing where you came from and where you're going. That's Merrimack style. Visit us at themerrimack.com.
Getting hoppy aroma into beer is a key consideration for any brewer making a quality IPA or pale ale, which requires some knowledge about how to get hoppy aroma into beer, right? And those compounds that may actually survive the various parts of the brewing process. Jordan, the gas hopper uses simple laws of physics to transfer aroma from hops into fully carbonated finished beer. How easy do you think it would be to implement something like that at home?
I'm not so sure it would be that easy. So maybe you can walk us through again. What was it at the production scale, and what do you think you could do at home?
Yeah. So it's really cool to me too. I think you could do this at home. It wouldn't be totally easy, right? It probably wouldn't be as easy as just continuing to dry hop. But again, you avoid some of those disadvantages of dry hopping. So two things. Let's talk first about how it works, right? And then second, how what your benefits of it are, right? And then of course we'll get to how you would do it at home. So how it works, it's really cool, right? It just uses this concept of an equilibrium and a concentration gradient. I say those two words and everybody goes, Cade's talking science again. Just tell it to me straight. Essentially what it is one of the kegs is hotter than the other one, right? And there's a higher concentration of those compounds in that hot keg. So those hot kegs, since it's hot, those compounds go up into the headspace, and there's a high concentration up in that headspace that's warm. That headspace is attached to the other keg, which is cold and has a low concentration of ingredients. So what that means is the compounds go from high concentration to low concentration until they are equal in both sides, right? Until the aroma is equal in both sides. It doesn't change the temperature of the cold keg. It doesn't change the temperature of the warm keg. All it does is move compounds from the warm keg to the cold keg.
Well, what's in the cold keg? What's in the hot keg?
Good. Oh yeah, good question. Of course, in the cold keg is beer, carbonated beer. All right, and in the hot keg is hops in water, and that's pretty much it. Carbonated hops in water, right? So essentially carbonated to the same level. It's going to carbonate to the same. You're going to get the same pressure in the headspace, and that's what creates that temperature and concentration gradient. So essentially, you have two pressurized carbonated kegs, and then one hot, one cold. Like I said, the beer cold, the hoppy water hot, and then it creates that concentration gradient.
And how many hops do you need to use, like per gallon or whatever?
Yeah, so Brian said to use the same amount. I think it was Brian. It might have been Philip. I can't remember exactly which one said it. But the same amount of hops that you would use. But here's the catch. The catch is all the benefits, right? You don't have to pop open your fermenter, right, to add hops to do this. You can just connect the headspace. Either you don't even have to worry about adding it in the fermenter. You can add it in a totally finished carbonated beer in your keg, right? So you don't ever have to expose your beer to oxygen. You don't have to worry about purging the headspace or running CO2 into the top of your fermenter. You don't have to worry about getting stuck in the bottom as you're racking, right? As you're racking the beer out of your fermenter over into your keg. You don't have to worry about it gumming up and getting stuck in the gas or in the liquid inlet of your keg if you're doing a closed transfer system. You don't have to worry about bagging up your hops. You can keep them totally loose and totally free in there. And for commercial brewers, hop creep is a real thing too. So if you add hops in there at the end of fermentation, which is when most people add dry hops, it causes that additional fermentation and potentially diacetyl production. That is a bigger problem for commercial brewers than it is for home brewers. Just again due to some laws of physics. But yeah.
Okay, so would there be any concern about suckback? Like, would you need positive pressure via CO2 in the system?
No, you just need the pressures to be the same. You just need the pressures to be at equilibrium. So, you want, and I would think also just enough volume in there, right? Like you don't need to put a whole lot of volume, but you need a gap between the gas dip tube and the other side. So that's again the big thing is the suck back actually is happening, but it's because it's the headspace that's being sucked back and forth, right? Or that's being sucked back, not the liquid, because you're not actually going to pull the liquid up to the gas tube. What you would do is you would just take two kegs, and I think this is how I would do it at home if it were me. You take two kegs, one of them's got beer in it that's fully carbonated, ready to go, and that one's cold, right? You attach the gas the gas post to the gas post of another keg that is got the hops and water in it and that's warm. Both kegs are pressurized, right? And that's all you do. And then you just let it set for 24 hours. And that hoppy aroma from the hop water keg is going to infuse the beer. And this was the coolest part. When they did this in their system, they made a beer that was actually hoppier than a dry hopped version.
Huh.
Isn't that crazy?
I have two thoughts. One is I wonder if it would be a similar aroma profile or different, and whether it's better or worse. And then two, there's got to be a flavor implication of dry hopping. And so even if you could make more or better aromas, you'd be missing that characteristic dry hop flavor that comes from the hops sitting in the cold beer post-fermentation.
Yeah, and so interestingly, your questions are interrelated, right? And the answer is the same to both of those questions. Yes, there's a flavor from dry hopping, but it's because of this concept of survivability, which I want to spend some time talking about here in just a second, because I think that's important to understanding getting hop aroma into your beer. You have to understand what actually survives into the beer. And I asked this question of Philip, and we were talking about like myrcenes and terpenes. Those compounds, if you agitate them or boil them or do anything like that, like a whirlpool, those terpenes are going to come out of solution. They don't want to be in beer. They're hydrophobic. It's like oil and water kind of thing. It's not exactly oil and water. So, for anybody out there that's listening, please don't write with feedback saying I said terpenes are oils. But it's the same concept. Terpenes just don't want to be in water. They're not polar enough to be in beer, which is also, a water-based beverage. And so, but they do like to be in CO2, like with CO2. And so, yes, those terpenes will actually transfer and you get more of those terpenes in your beer. So myrcene is a big terpene, and that's a flavor that's kind of got this herbal, grassy aroma. Noble hops are high in terpenes. Things that won't actually stay over there, or that won't maybe increase, are things like thiols, or thiols might, because they're pretty volatile. But things like linalool, geraniol, these like fruity and floral characteristics, and maybe some of the esters as well, I think is what Philip talked about in there too. But some of these other characters that just aren't that are already in the beer, if you're dry hopping with a beer, that are already there, that you're not going to need to add or accentuate those. So there is going to be a difference between a beer that's dry hopped versus one that has the gas hopper, right? Because there are going to be there's compounds that are going to make it in vegetable polyphenols, non-bitter or non-volatile compounds that are going to be there from dry hops, that are going to affect the flavor of the beer. There's some downsides to that, which I'll get to in just a second. But the other side is, even if you just looked at the aromatic compounds and measured the aromatic compounds in either of them, they're going to be different, because the aromatic compounds from dry hop some of them are going to get pulled out whenever the dry hops settle out, and they're also not going to survive into the beer solution, which is also sort of interesting. So yeah, they may taste different, but as Philip was saying, if you played around with this method, you might be able to actually change the temperature that you hold the beer at, or the water keg at, and encourage some of these things to actually volatilize. So like you might put it up at a really high temperature, and that encourages other things to volatilize, or put it down at a cold temperature, like room temperature, and some things will still volatilize, because even at room temperature, these things are carbonated, and so there's going to be some aroma coming off of these. And so knowing those different, again, they haven't done this research, and I'm not going to spend the time on this episode to talk about, the different temperatures of different compounds and how they might volatilize. But suffice it to say, yeah, it should taste different than a dry hopped beer, but it should still taste hoppy and have hoppy aroma, and maybe in some cases better, because you got the compounds that you wanted without those other downsides. Downsides are things like bitterness stripping. So whenever you put dry hops in your beer, when it settles out, it pulls out some of those bittering compounds. It also adds polyphenols, which deal with mouthfeel. So you might have a beer that you like the mouthfeel of, but you just want to add some hop aroma and flavor. If you add dry hops to it, you change the mouthfeel. And then the final thing too is when you add hops to these beers, you are exposing them to oxygen. And even if you purge and all that sort of stuff, there's still a little bit of oxygen that's getting into your beer. So that's traditionally why, dry hopped beers have a shorter shelf life than non-dry hopped beer. This is an opportunity where oxygen doesn't ever get to your beer because it's closed transferred and pressurized. Both of them are, especially you would have to use deaerated water, which is another thing too we need to mention. But in any event, this is a way to avoid oxygen and those downsides of getting into your beer.
Right. And so what this strikes me as is like the considerations around using cryo or flowables for your quote dry hop load is it doesn't taste the same as T90. And so that's why a lot of people recommend, if you're going to use something like Spectrum or even cryo, to blend in some T90 with it, or whole cone if you're going to use whole cone for dry hopping, because it just doesn't have the same flavors, given that there's parts of the plant matter that are taken out. And so it's part of this is about consumer or drinker expectation. We think IPAs and the dry hop flavors associated with them taste like X because for years we've been using T90, and now all this new stuff is coming out. It's not that it's better or worse, really. It's just different. And the consumer expectation, I think, is solidly in the T90 camp at this point. Yeah. And so since we have that expectation, I just think that it's going to taste, quote, off if we're not using any. Not that that's a bad thing, just different.
Yeah, I wonder. I mean, this would be interesting because obviously I've never tried a beer that was gas hopped, right? Yeah, I mean, you haven't either. We haven't either. We've tried stuff with just liquid extract, and sure, that's certainly a common refrain there. Interestingly, though, too, you don't have to replace dry hops, right? I'm talking about it as replacing dry hops, but Philip and Brian weren't talking about it as replacing dry hops. They were, like you said, talking about using it in conjunction with hops. So the idea is you can get different aroma compounds into your beer using this gas hopper than you would if you dry hopped, right? And I think that's a cool way to play with this too.
Yeah, I find that super exciting, and that's really consistent with what I've been doing in my hoppy beers lately, is really layering in. So I dry hopped a West Coast Pilsner yesterday, and it had Mosaic, amongst other hops, in the boil, in the whirlpool, and that was straight Mosaic T90. But then going into the dry hop phase, I used Mosaic Lupomax and Mosaic Spectrum, along with other non-Mosaic T90 varieties. And so it's kind of like if you look at on the website, my Mosaic Cyclone beer, it's using every Mosaic product I could possibly get my hands on. And by layering in additional varieties within the same variety, like Lupomax or Cryo, etc., you can get a more dynamic and punchier flavor and aroma. And so this gas hopper thing is exactly what I want. Let's just, more is better to a certain extent when it comes to IPAs and hops. Like, you don't want to use 50 ounces in a 5-gallon batch. There is a point of no return. But in terms of different types of products, it seems that layering them can really give you a world-class product that you wouldn't get with just using a single product like just T90s.
Yeah, exactly. Just T90s or just Spectrum or any of those other products, right? And I mean, home brewers, I think, drink their beer faster than a lot of commercial brewers expect their beers to get drunk, right? But I think there are home brewers out there that like shelf stability too, that need a beer, that want to have 3 or 4 beers on tap, so they've got some variety, and that means that they drink those beers a little slower, right? They're not drinking an IPA in a month; they're drinking it over 3 months or 4 months, and that might be longer than the shelf life of a normal IPA. So things like this, using the gas hopper or advanced hop products like Spectrum or other things, might be ways for home brewers to actually increase the shelf stability of their beers. Now, real quick, I don't want to go too crazy into this because it wasn't really discussed with Brian and Philip, but I think it is important to understand, getting hop aroma into your beer. And it's this concept of survivables. And I really thank YCH, Yakima Chief Hops, for doing this. I'm stealing from a presentation that I saw online by Tesha Shalati who gave this, and she was talking about hop survivables. And it's really cool. You can find this, by the way, by just Googling hop survivables. There's this awesome graph with YCH branded hops with a couple others in there. You know, there's Cascade and Willamette and some of the other ones that, Centennial, that's in there too. Some of the other ones that are really popular. But it's got Citra, Mosaic, Idaho 7, Azaka, Talus, Sabro, El Dorado, all of those trademarked hops that YCH, or that the Hop Breeding Company has done. But essentially what this tells you is they measured what they call quote unquote survivables, and they classified them into groups. So there are certain compounds that make it into your beer depending on where you use them. All right. So some hops are better for using earlier in the brewing process, quote unquote, and some of them are better, quote unquote, for using them later in the brewing process. So think of a hop like Cascade. Cascade has bitterness, right? It can be used as a bittering hop. It can be used in the boil. And traditionally, if you look at Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, it was used like throughout the whole thing, right? It was used twice in the boil and then in a dry hop. And it makes Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, which is this awesome compound. But it's kind of low in survivables. So things that would boil off do with Cascade. So Cascade is kind of a good hop for dry hopping, but it may not be the best hop for putting in the boil. Cross that with like Centennial, and Centennial has a huge number of compounds that make it all the way through the boiling process, that survive. So Centennial would be a great hop for using earlier in the brewing process. And it's a really cool way to think about this. Whenever I started brewing, I didn't think about hops as having like the compounds associated with them. I just thought like, oh, I like Citra because it's got citrus in it. And so people use that in the dry hop, and that's where I should use it. But Jordan, we've spent, how many episodes? 10 or 15, just talking about like different ways, different uses of Citra in the Whirlpool and, Spectrum and T90 and all these different advanced hop products. It's really cool to think about how the hop compounds survive into the beer. And I mean, I know you've looked at the survivable stuff before too.
Yeah, and it's funny. I had a bit of a revelation recently, personally. I made a Saison style-ish kind of beer, and I wanted to use some Rawaka to kind of create what I'm kind of getting out of Rawaka is a bit of almost like a green bottle character. Rawaka can be really high in this diesel kind of character. And I found that it kind of is reminiscent of a little bit of Light Struck. And so I was like, well, what if I could kind of replicate that in a Saison DuPont kind of thing, but not actually Light Strucking it, just using the Rawaka hops. So I only added them in the Whirlpool. I did not dry hop that Saison beer, and it's really fantastic. However, it's not really strong on the diesel character. And so my conclusion is that the diesel character is not surviving even a Whirlpool, and it's really more effectively extracted via a dry hop approach. And so I'm curious, of the survivable compounds that exist, like in this graph, do you know which one we would attribute to diesel?
I don't know which one we would attribute to diesel, but I do know there are a lot of compounds. Like that's the thing I used to not like about Simcoe, because I was getting this diesel aroma from Simcoe. It's interesting too, because if you tell hop growers that you smell diesel in a hop, they go, we don't use diesel in our hop kilns anymore. And it's like, I know, but there's still some diesel there. It's maybe not the best way for me to say it, but yeah, I get that gasoline character, and it is maybe volatile. And diesel, I don't know the one specifically, but using that idea of like linalool. So this is one that is responsible for like fruity aromas in beer, right? Like sort of generic fruity pebbles aromas. And so if you look at that hop, that compound, it has some good survivability characteristics, but it's not great. It's not a great survivable compound. It's not one of those compounds that's going to make it all the way through the process. So using this YCH graph, you can look at something like linalool and combine a hop that has a high concentration of linalool with something that has a low concentration of linalool, so that you can have something that's like mix these two hops together and get like the fully maximized aroma from the hops. For example, if you combine two hops that both have high concentrations of linalool, you're not getting a whole lot extra from that second hop, right? You're just getting a whole lot of linalool from both hops. So why are you putting both of those hops in your beer? Again, linalool is one of those compounds that survives in beer, but it doesn't it's not a perfect survivor, right? It doesn't survive all the way through the brewing process. So that's one of those that you can look at, use this chart and mix and match hops. Like say you want one that's got more myrcene character in it. You want some of that herbal floral characteristics. You're brewing a Pilsner or something, right? Not even one that's like known for hoppy flavor, but you want some of that like noble, herbal and floral characteristics. Well, if you're using, a laurel, for example, that doesn't have very much of those characteristics in it. So using laurel isn't maybe your best hop choice for that. But using something like Centennial or CTZ, I'm probably going to get people shaking their head at me going like, I'm not using that in a Pilsner. I'm only going to use, Tettnang or something. But those compounds also have it too. And so some of these you might be able to use, and supplement whenever you don't have those hops on hand. So anyway, this concept of survivables, and I bring it up in connection with the gas hopper because we're essentially doing the same thing. You lose a lot of survivables depending on how you add hops in the process. So of course, boiling boils off a lot of survivables, but even dry hopping, you pull things out of the beer. Dry hopping has this stripping effect. When you put dry hops in the beer, it strips a bunch of flavor and aroma out of the beer, adds a whole bunch of flavor and aroma. So it's not like a net loss, but things come out. And when you lose those things, it changes the flavor of your beer. If you taste the beer before dry hopping and taste the beer after dry hopping, obviously it's going to taste different and there's going to be more hop character in the one that is dry hopped, right? But measuring the chemical compounds, right, and using different kinds of hops results in different outcomes. And so that's where something like the gas hopper can be used, like you said, Jordan, to layer on additional flavors that either got stripped out or don't make it into the beer because of their inherent non-survivability.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So with the gas hopper, they're adding hop volatiles, whatever, that wouldn't have been there otherwise, right? But there are a couple examples out there of people trying to retain them that would otherwise blow off. So one thing I've heard about is in cold IPA is capping the fermentation tank during the dry hop phase and doing a spunding effectively. And the theory being that you're not off-gassing the hoppy aromas into the air, and they're staying in the beer because they're not leaving the tank in the first place. Now, when doing that, there's always the risk of excessive sulfur production or excessive sulfur capture, so something to be aware of. But something cool that Martin did on a recent Brülosophy show episode is this was the Hop Chronicles Pacific Jade episode from about a month ago, if you're listening to this when this first drops. And he actually did Marshall's daisy chain method for blow-off, where his fermentation off-gassing is connected to a keg that's filled with sanitizer that's then connected to another keg that's empty that has the poppet or whatever pulled, so that the fermentation off-gassing is purging the serving keg. And therefore free CO2, so you're not wasting CO2 that you purchase from the store, better for the environment, more sustainable, and more affordable. But his theory was, what if the fermentation gas from a hoppy beer that I'm using to purge the serving keg, could that gas contain some hops in it? Because it's off-gassing from the fermentation, right? And so instead of just using kind of, quote, neutral canned CO2, what if he used the hoppy CO2 from his fermentation? Thus, ostensibly, the keg that he serves it out of is going to be hoppier because he's retaining some of those aromatic compounds that would have blown off otherwise. He's so crazy, he even used that gas to purge his hop bong for his dry hop addition, so that even that purging of the headspace to add as dry hop at the end of fermentation, that was purged with ostensibly hoppy CO2. So he watched the video. It's a great episode, and he does say it's a great, hoppy beer. Unfortunately, it wasn't like a side-by-side, so there's no triangle to determine whether it actually added more hoppiness, but it certainly couldn't hurt. And so that's another one we might have to experiment on.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's one of those things I wondered. I've never thought about it that way, right? I've always just thought about this as a way to purge and control cold side oxidation. I never thought about it like, yeah, if you rack into that serving keg, are you actually retaining a bunch of those hoppy compounds that made it through, or even not hoppy compounds, but yeasty fermentation compounds that made it over into that other keg and they've just been trapped there, right? So yeah, that's really interesting. I wonder.
And it makes me wonder for lager if that could be a bad idea, that you just have a keg filled with sulfur off-gassing and then you're putting your beer that has desulfured, effectively back into the sulfuric, atmosphere, CO2 solution or whatever.
Oh, yuck. Yeah, that could be really bad for lager beers. But we said that's really interesting. I wonder if there's a way, to do an experiment on that with it, where you're like capture the fermentation gas in one, and then just don't capture, like purge the keg. Like, oh man. It's interesting because I'm thinking now, like, how would you do it? How would you like keep the other keg, free of CO2? Because essentially, I guess you could just go into a purged keg, right? You could just save that keg. You could have one that's hooked up in the daisy chain method, and then one, you just don't use the keg that was daisy chained. You just have your own like purged keg that you could rack into, and then go from there and compare those two together. But that would be kind of cool to see if that actually increases, aroma or flavor of the beer by using that.
Yeah, totally. Something we should, I think, add to the list. So maybe going forward, I don't know how much time we've left in this segment, but I thought it might be kind of cool to spend this episode talking about like practical applications of creating and maintaining hoppy aroma in beers, because I think that, I don't know that we have a whole hour of gas hopper nerding out to do. So maybe we could talk about some kind of more, quote, standard ways.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'd love to talk about some standard ways. We'll talk a little bit about hop side and cold side, and it is time for us to take a break, so we'll do that right when we come back.
Established in 1995, More Beer has been consistently serving the greater brewing community since the times IPA was expected to be bitter and clear, and there are reasons they've stuck around so long. In addition to their massive product selection and excellent customer service, More Beer has locations on both the west and the east coast of the United States, which translates into fast shipping times regardless of where you live. And when you spend more than $59, shipping is free. When you're in need of brewing ingredients and gear, there's no better option than morebeer.com, one of the most trusted shops on the planet.
Hops have been added to beer for hundreds of years, but they've recently become stars, taking key roles in the flavor and aroma of lots of different beer styles. Jordan, would you describe yourself as a hophead?
I totally would. But I'm not like exclusively, obsessed with hoppy beers. I love lagers. I love Belgian beers, you name it. But man, there's something about an IPA that's just one of the most amazing, experiences in the modern world. Little funny anecdote. I have a self-proclaimed hophead friend, and he literally only drinks IPAs. That's all he drinks. He brews beer. He homebrews as well. And he tends to go on like a yearly tropical vacation. We'll go to like Jamaica or something. And he brings hop oil with him to dose in the Red Stripes because he cannot drink a lager. And in Jamaica, they don't have ready access to IPA. So he's turning frickin' Red Stripe into effectively IPAs of sorts on demand in the bottle because he just couldn't not have a hoppy beer.
We need to get him some euphorics or some or some hop kick that he can take with him, right?
Exactly.
And just, drop it in there.
He's been using whatever prior oil that you could add, like Glacier Hops brand or something like that. But euphorics and hop kick, that's a great idea.
Oh man, yeah, that's hilarious. Dropping hop aroma into beer. That's not something generally that I do. I do like IPAs. I love them. I would consider myself a hophead in that one. That's what I'm studying. So I study a lot about hops. But I would also consider it even in lagers because hops play a pivotal and key role in beer, and it's because of this flavor and aroma that we like. And that's a hard thing to do as a brewer, is to get hoppy aroma and flavor into beer and then keep it there. Get it there. Keep it there. Those are the two challenges when using hops. So let's talk first about getting aroma into beer, Jordan, and then we'll talk about keeping it in there. So how do you want to start talking about getting hops into beer?
Well, yeah, so thinking through the process here, you collect your water, you mash in, and then you get to your boil. So I guess you could add mash hops. We've talked about that in prior episodes as a way to get thiol character, which I guess is effectively a hoppy, flavor and aroma, although it's kind of like a fourth dimension in of sorts. So we'll just leave thiols, unlocking bound thiols, to a different episode. Listen back to prior episodes for that. So I wouldn't expect a ton of aroma in a standard non-thiolized beer out of a mash hop. And then similarly, with your boil, the earlier you add your hops, the less aroma you're going to get. So a 60-minute addition might effectively have no aromas. And it's really not until more mid-boil, and especially at the end of the boil, when you're able to extract aromas from a boil. And so that's why whirlpools are so popular in hoppy brewing, is you're able to get a lot of that delicate, beautiful, kind of tropical, citrusy, what have you, aroma via a lower temperature, not boiling and volatilizing it and blowing it off.
Yeah, totally. I kind of tend to think about hops and getting them into beer in terms of like traditional methods and modern methods, right? Because you mentioned mash hopping, and I would certainly think that's a modern method, or at least something that is becoming more popular. I don't know if it was used hundreds of years ago. Maybe it was. I'm sure somebody threw hops into their mash, right? Like at least one person did that. But it wasn't super popular. But I think of them sort of like as traditional versus modern. And traditionally, hops were first added during the boil. And like you said, they're added at the 60 minutes, and that results in bitterness. And then maybe in the middle of the boil results in some aroma, but also still some bitterness and still some survivables, right? Because you're blowing off all the volatiles in the boil, but there's a lot of hop material, like we were talking about earlier, polyphenols and things like that contribute to body and maybe some aroma and flavor in this way. It's why a product like Kettle Ready, which is an advanced hop product, again, I would put that in the modern camp, but Kettle Ready is intended to be a modern way to do that same thing, to get boil hop character, right? To get hot side hop character, not just dry hop and whirlpool stuff. But that's kind of the way that I think about it. And then, of course, you've got potentially a whirlpool, which I think, again, is a little bit of a modern solution, although maybe people were doing that. And then the dry hop. And of course, dry hopping is a very common way that was done, especially in the late 1800s and early 1900s, for getting hop aroma and preserving the beer, actually, right? The hop's preservative capacity was one of the big things for doing that. So I kind of think of things in that way, like traditionally getting hop into the beer, using a bittering addition and a flavor addition at the end of the boil, and then dry hopping. But modern science, especially in like the past 20, 30 years, where we've actually started like dedicating, entire research papers to hops. This is, I'll do a quick aside real quick. I studied hop creep for my master's thesis. There was a paper in 1893 that talked about hop creep. And then the second paper on hop creep was in 1941, which was almost 50 years later. And then the third paper on hop creep was in 2018. Okay. And so it's like nobody was studying what's going on when we add hops to beer during dry hop. That's not totally true. People were studying things, but at least not studying this hop creep phenomenon, which hop creep's been going on for at least 100 years. As long as people have been dry hopping, hop creep has been occurring. But that's kind of an aside in that hops weren't a big deal in the 70s, at least in the United States. In the 60s, 70s, and 80s, it was all light lager, and light lager was not known for hops. It was known for that yeasty estery profile. There's a little bit of hops to add bitterness, but we're not talking aroma. So getting aroma into beer, to me, has become a real like modern challenge, making the IPA, which you said is the number one craft beer style in the United States. And so that's been really cool. And I love seeing the innovation of brewers. I mean, you said mash hopping, but also the thing that I still haven't tried, but I know you haven't talked about, dip hopping, right? Is another one that's really interesting. Whirlpooling at different flavors and aromas to get stuff in there differently. Mid-fermentation dry hopping for biotransformation, and then mash hopping for thiols, right? For thiol inclusion. All this is really cool in really interesting ways. So maybe let's spend a couple of minutes on those. You talked about mash hopping, but what is dip hopping?
Well, actually, Cade, before we talk dip hopping, can we just stay in the boil for just a second? Because I'd love to give some practical guidelines for what I think really maximize hop aroma via the boil. So in the whirlpool, I've come down to I like to kill the flame or kill the element, and then I immediately toss them in. And I want to recirculate those. I've found that the cool pool, where you start at like 170, I'm always trying to balance the bitterness, right? So I'm in this Brewfather software. You can specify the temperature at which you're whirlpooling, the time, and so on and so forth. And for like a West Coast IPA, the amount that you can add to hit your target bitterness is crazy high if you do a cool pool of like 170. Like you could literally add like 8 ounces or something and only get 30 IBUs or whatever it might be. That's off the top of my head. But the point being is that you can add a ton of hops if you lower that temperature. However, I found that is a little different tasting maybe, but also you're adding so much hops that like the polyphenol charge or something is so high that it's really hard to clear. So that's why for West Coast IPAs, I really like that just flame out temp, because we're accounting for the IBUs that it's theoretically grabbing. And it seems to strike a better balance in terms of like polyphenol load, et cetera, as it relates to clarity and flavor for West Coast style. I think if you're doing a hazy IPA, feel free to drop that temp, use more hops. That would be in style. So in terms of numbers, I've found through a lot of trial and error that about an ounce-ish, ounce and a half, ounce and a quarter per gallon of wort is a really good whirlpool rate for West Coast IPA. So basically that's 5-6 ounces in a 5-gallon net batch. I know you think that's crazy, but
I think that's crazy.
I swear, man, it's like it is. I'm making hoppy beers that are punching you in the face with hop aroma, but it's not too much. It's not like this is a hop burn or anything like that. And so I found about an ounce per gallon of how much you actually have in your kettle is about right.
Yeah.
Mind your P's and Q's, look at Brewfather, make sure your IBUs are dialed in. So for that reason, I don't use Lupomax or Cryo in the whirlpool because the alpha acid is too high. And so I save those for dry hop because I'm not concerned about isomerization and IBU extraction via dry hopping. So I think that lower alphas are good, like Motueka, et cetera, have lower alphas, relatively speaking. But American varieties like Citra and Mosaic are like higher. And so that's one way you can kind of balance it out, is using some lower alpha varieties in your whirlpool, like some of these noble descendants out of New Zealand. And I really think that the best way to go here is to mix and match. Like I said, with the Mosaic slide clone example, you could use multiple varieties of a given strain, like Mosaic T90 and Mosaic, Lupomax, et cetera, and kind of get more layered flavor there. But as you know from our single hop series, the Hop Chronicles, they're not as complex and dynamic when you just use one hop. So in your whirlpool, I like to use at least 2, 3, maybe 4 varieties. And part of it's just what I have on hand. And I really like blending New Zealand and American hops. So these days, if I'm making a hoppy beer, New Zealand hops are almost guaranteed to make an appearance. Personally, I haven't been a fan of how Australian hops have been expressing recently. I've heard that this year's been a lot better, and hopefully the crop year that's about to come out will be even better. So that would be kind of my recommendations for the whirlpool. Multiple varieties, focusing on the sexies, Citra, Mosaic, Simcoe, etc., going straight at flame out and recirculating if you can.
Yeah, those are really, really great practical tips. I hope everybody was able to get that. And if you didn't, rewind and re-listen to that, because those are really, really good tips. Minding your bitterness is a key thing. And again, that was Mark Malowicki that did that in the early 2000s, that showed that, even at those temperatures, whirlpool temperatures below boiling, there are other bittering compounds that come into hops. So things like, the calculator that John Paul Hossam made that was back on, what episode was that? I don't know, mid-70s or something like that, I think. I don't have it off the top of my head right now, but he made an entire calculator to look at things like the whirlpool and the dry hop and late flame additions and changing the temperature and changing the pH and all these other considerations that you can dial in to get that bitterness in control. So that's a huge key. That's right. whoa, holy moly, 4 ounces or 5 ounces of hops in a whirlpool. That's like 100 to 150 grams for a 20-liter batch for the metric folks out there. But that just seems like a crap load of hops in a whirlpool. When you started saying like, an ounce to an ounce and a quarter to an ounce and a half, I was like, really? I didn't think Jordan did that low on a whirlpool batch. But you were saying per variety or something, per gallon, right? And there's a 5 gallons, of course, in a homebrew batch. But hey, if that strikes you and you like that, that's great. I'm certainly more in that like 2 ounce around, and then I'm doing, again, probably not more than 2 or 3 ounces in a dry hop.
Well, I was going to say, wait till we get to the dry hop, then we'll talk big numbers. All right.
I know.
Let's keep going here in the process. So next up might be dip hopping, and I guess similarly fermentation dry hops. So the dip hopping method is you're basically reserving some hot water or hot wort and holding a dry hop charge in it in like a closed environment, and then ultimately when the boil is finished and chilled, that gets racked on top of it, and all that is fermented. So it's like a fermentation dry hop that has some level of heat applied to it first. Kind of wonky. I actually did an experiment where I compared a dip hopped beer versus no dip hop, so no other dry hop in either beer. Tasters could tell a difference, but it wasn't like crazy like explosions of additional character. So it's more of a nuanced like thing. And so like even, rumors of Japanese lager brewers doing it to add a little extra oomph. But what I've found is really nice is dip hopping with the flowable incognito. So this is kind of at this point known as the Kelsey McNair method from North Park. He really pioneered this. And in a recent Patreon-only chat with the John I. Haas team, I asked them, are you guys ever going to admit that this is a good idea? And he's like, no. We know people are doing it, but we're not willing to recommend people use this contrary to its intended use, which is in the whirlpool. So feel free to use the incognito product in the whirlpool. It does work. I've just really love what it's adding when I add it as a dip hop. And so I use I was using jars. They've switched. They were 20-gram jars, and I would use an entire one in a 5-gallon fermentation. They've switched to 16-gram sachets, and I'm excited because it's going to be a lot easier to get out, and I'm probably not getting all of it out of the little jar anyway, so maybe it's going to be about the same amount. So I'm okay with just dropping that a little bit and going down to 16 grams going forward once I get some more incognito in the house. But if I have it in my fridge, I'm using incognito flowable dip hop method in every hoppy beer I'm making, be it West Coast Pilsner or West Coast IPA, because I really love this nuanced aroma amplification that it adds. But we are not done there because you still got to dry hop this beer.
Yeah, I was going to say, introducing the new Haas product, hop dipping or hop dip or something, that's basically incognito that you just add in the fermenter. No, I'm joking, of course. And Jeff, if you're listening, hey, I came up with that idea, so it's now trademarked. No, that's funny. Yeah, I mean, things like this are really cool, right? Dip hopping, again, the whole idea is that you're moving things later in the process. You're putting a little bit more of those survivables into the beer. And yeah, next up is dry hopping. But even then, dry hopping doesn't have to take place in what I would call the traditional dry hop, which is like near or at the end of fermentation. Now you're seeing things like dry hopping at yeast pitch or dry hopping at full Krausen, right? Or whatever, a day into fermentation. And that's because of biotransformation. So yeast interactions with hops are also super important. And so that's something that you can play around with, is when to add your hops to beer. And then, of course, advanced hop products like Spectrum. But some practical aspects of adding hops, of course, this depends on the style and what you're trying to do. East Coast styles, hazy IPAs, are going to have a huge load of whirlpool hops and dry hops. I would also argue that West Coast IPAs are going to have a bigger, probably dry hop load, but maybe a less whirlpool load for the reasons that Jordan talked about, but dry hopping is still huge. So for me, if I'm making a West Coast or a hazy IPA, I'm still probably around 3 to 4 ounces in a 5-gallon homebrew batch. So that's 75 to 100 grams in a 20 hectoliter batch, or sorry, 20 liter. Whoa, not 20 hectoliters. That'd be crazy. In a 20 liter homebrew batch. But and I would think like that's a reasonable hopping amount, but people like Jordan disagree. That's not even close.
We're just getting started, Cade. Yeah. So this most recent, I brewed an IPA today, and my plan for this is a 5-gallon fermentation, and so my plan for dry hopping is going to be 4 ounces of Nectaron, 2 ounces of Citra Lupomax, an ounce of Strata T90, and then a half packet of Citra Spectrum.
Okay. Wow.
So that collectively is 10-ish ounces.
Yeah.
And you can see I'm layering in various products. We've got New Zealand, we've got American. We've got T90, we've got Lupomax, we've got Spectrum. And then by layering these different products, we're able to get a more potent hop aroma and flavor. And I'm telling you, man, it's awesome. It's so good. And arguably, this is a, quote, double dry hop. And so that is one approach that certainly works, is splitting your dry hop in half and adding either, you could do half at the beginning of the half at the beginning of the fermentation. You could do half towards the end of fermentation. You could do half after fermentation and then rack off that, or even just add it on top the second load that's all after fermentation. But generally with double dry hops, the second half, if not both halves, are going to happen after fermentation. So I'm probably arguably dry hopping at a, quote, double dry hop rate, but I'm too scared of oxidation introduction, so I just add it all at once. I do not mess around with staged dry hops. It's also just easier in my life, and so I'll just add it all at once fermentation is end or pretty much ending. And again, I'm exclusively brewing West Coast styles at this point, but I think that if you are making a hazy IPA, maybe mess around with adding half or all of your dry hop load during fermentation, because with strains like Conan or London Ale 3, you might get some biotransformation that you're going to really enjoy in a hazy style.
Well, hop growers and certainly like the hop distributors love you because, 10 ounces of hops and all those different products, right? Like layering on all that different stuff. That's 300 grams for a 20 liter, batch for the metric folks. That's a crap load of hops. But I was going to say, hey, you've heard of this thing the dry hop saturation point, right? But I remembered as you were talking through there, you talked about layering on all those different flavors. And back in episode 1 of the podcast, I talked to Dr. Tom Shellhammer about the dry hop saturation point and asked him that question. What if you used different hops? Because in their study that Scott LaFontaine did, they used Cascade hops and they added it at different grams per liter. So it was like 0 to 10, they went all the way up to 16 grams per liter. But they found that above 8 grams per liter, so that's about, that's about 2 ounces or 3 ounces in a dry hop, that there was no benefit, that you had a diminishing return on the hoppy aroma and flavor above that amount, above 2 or 3 ounces. So you are potentially putting in 7 to 8 ounces of additional hop product that isn't doing anything to the beer. But I asked him, what if you used different hops, right? What if you combined hops that had different components in there? And he said, yeah, makes sense. If you layer on different hops, then yeah, you can maximize like, hey, this herbal tea character that I get from Cascade at a high rate is something that I want in this beer. And then I add Citra and I get thiols from it, or I get whatever other compound. And these two things play really, really well together. So you may have reached the saturation point for some compound that you're looking for in one hop, but then you can add different hops and layer additional flavors on, because the compounds are going to be dependent, right? It's not like the hop is saturated, it's the compounds that you want that get saturated. So if you're using different compounds and layering those flavors on, yeah, putting 10 ounces suddenly starts to make sense. And maybe that's why some brewers, they hear that and they go, yeah, I don't care. I'm throwing 6 ounces in because it definitely makes a difference. If I put 3 ounces of these hops in, it's not as hoppy and it doesn't taste as good as if I put 6 or 10. Because we hear brewers say that anecdotally all the time. And that was what Tom's response was yeah, of course, we used one hop. And so we probably reached the maximum threshold of some compound that's really important in this hop flavor or hop aroma. But if you layer hops, totally, that's a way to add in more.
That's really interesting because I never thought about that a given hop variety, there might be a saturation point. And the other thing is, I think this is a correction. I believe that study, they actually just tasted aroma, because I think that we applied the science on that one time when I first kicked off with you. And I asked you about that, and you're like, wow, yeah, the study was based on aroma. So maybe ostensibly there is a flavor impact that's independent of the saturation point when it comes to aroma.
Yeah, sure. There are, again, so aroma and flavor are interrelated. So this is another Jeff Daly podcast that we talked about. So I'm kind of careful at this point to talk about aroma anytime we're talking about like hoppy flavor and characteristics. If we're talking about bitterness, or if we're talking about like sweetness or mouthfeel or something, that's flavor from hops. But aroma, you're talking about fruity or citrus or herbal or floral or perfumey or any of those things. That's aroma, even if you taste it. There's retronasal and I can't remember what the other one is. Retronasal is when you drink it and it hits the back flavor receptors, or the orthonasal, which is whenever you just smell it through your nose, right? And so those two things can smell a little bit different, but they're both aromas. neither of them are actual flavors. Again, the flavors are the basic tastes: sweet, salty, bitter, sour, umami, and potentially fat.
Yeah, well, but there's, chlorophenols or chlorophyll or whatever. There's all these things in the plant matter that's got to add something, right? And so for that reason, there's got to be a point of no return where it's like you're doing more damage than positives. Hop burn is obviously gnarly, and we don't want hop burn. So I would say like a 20-ounce dry hop in a 5-gallon batch probably wouldn't taste good. There's also the physical parameters related to separation, right? And so at the dry hopping levels that I'm doing, I actually like to do 6-gallon ferments if I can, because I'm losing so much that you can have a pretty wimpy keg once you separate from the dry hops. I will also acknowledge that I didn't say cryo back there. I don't like it. It's got this weird spicy hot burny thing. I'm sure that if you use like a very small proportion, it could be a nice little amplifier, but it's very convenient because we're sponsored by Yakima Valley Hops. It's owned by John I. Haas, right? And they don't make cryo. That's a competing product. And I find Lupomax to be so good, and cryo, not a fan. And it's funny, you don't see that many pro brewers advertising Lupomax. Everyone's on the cryo train. But I'm a big Lupomax fan, and it doesn't have that hot burn effect. It's just like punchy. And really, they say use Lupomax at 50%. Nah, just use it at a normal rate and just know you're going to get more character. A couple of things I want to mention is I am reducing my pH at Flameout to about 5. Maybe that has some sort of implication for hoppy flavor and aroma. I'm also dry hopping at room temp. I'm not dry hopping cold, and I'm both whirlpooling and dry hopping free. And so I don't want to bag my hops. I don't want to constrain them. I want them to be free floating. So you just have to we talked about this in feedback last week, actually, right? You just need to devise a system that allows you to separate this stuff, because things can get clogged, right? Be it dip tubes or filters or whatever. So I'm just dry hopping falling fermentation for 24 hours at room temp, which might be 65 or whatever I'm finishing fermentation at. And then I'm under pressure crash cooling for like overnight or 24 hours, and then transferring that off into a purge serving keg for serving. I do the Santa Clean purge method, where we fill it all the way to the brim and then push that out, because we don't want any oxidation getting there, because after we've put in this much product and this much effort and care into our hoppy beer, we could lose it all when it comes to oxidation risk. And you tested it out one time, and I unfortunately had to try that beer.
Yeah, exactly. I did test that out on you guys, and I still feel sad about that. Bringing this up, and just like one of these beers really sucks, and one of these beers is really good. But yeah, exactly. So I mean, of course, oxidation and monitoring your oxidation or exposure to oxygen is super important. That's a key component of keeping that hoppy aroma and flavor into beer. But before we get there, I want to ask a question, Jordan. I would guess that you've had this experience, probably not recently because you've got dialed in your hopping, but if you ever made a beer that you drank it and you were like, it's just not hoppy enough, right? You're just like, man, I wish there was a little bit more hops in this, or I wish it had this other flavor that is just missing, and why I don't know why this flavor isn't in there.
I mean, a lot of commercial beers that are from breweries that aren't known to be like hype-worthy IPA breweries. But for me, myself, my beers are not like that anymore, because I'm using so many hops and I'm layering them in smartly and doing everything I can to mitigate oxidation. So you got to come over for a beer, man, coming up to Portland. Because I'm telling you, these beers are punching you in the face with tropical citrus, etc. But they're not like bitter bombs or hop burns or anything like that. It's a really nice balance. And I should also note, I'm getting them clear with gelatin. And so it's looking hazy, going into fermentation and maybe even coming out. But even with these super high hop loads, I like gelatin, and I do a closed transfer. We talked about that in prior episodes as well. But isinglass or, what's the popular one? Clarity Firm? No, not Clarity Firm. What's the popular one?
You mean for shoot, why
the
am
silica?
I blanking on it? Yeah, it's the silica. It's Biofine. There we go.
Biofine.
Yeah.
That's it. That's a popular one.
Yeah.
That stuff does work, and your beer, despite crazy high dry hop loads, doesn't have to be hazy.
So I asked that question, though, because I'm sure there was at some point in your brewing practice where you brewed a beer and you were like, I wish it was more hoppy. And then you decided, okay, I'm going to use Spectrum, or, I'm going to use, Lupamax, or, I'm going to change this or change that. I'm sure that a lot of brewers have that, and where they taste their beer and they go, okay, on the next batch, here's what I'm going to do differently. But you now have the opportunity using something like the gas hopper or something like Hopkick or Euphorics or these water-based soluble extracts. You can add those directly into a finished beer.
Yeah, and I actually had an issue like this recently at a homebrew club meeting. We had a guy brought a beer, then he wasn't satisfied with it, and he's like, "There's just not enough hop, aroma, and flavor in there. Like, do you guys have any recommendations for how I fix this?" And I had a recommendation, of course. And so he's like, "Could I dry hop it again?" And people were like, "Yeah, you could do that." And I'm like, "This is actually problematic because adding dry hops to carbonated beer is not a good idea." As soon as you throw those in, it's going to start foaming and exploding out of the keg, and your beer's gone. You've destroyed it. You've lost it all, right? And then what's left, you might have oxidized because of all the foaming and so on, and having the keg open. So my answer was Spectrum. Spectrum, you could add it in line through your gas in tube, like I do with my gelatin, and you can add that to the serving tank, and it's not like you have to separate it out into yet another one. So Spectrum is a nice idea in a case where you've dry hopped your beer and it just doesn't have enough. You can use this to amp it up, even though it's already carbonated and ready to serve.
Yeah, exactly. Carbonated, ready to serve, adding something like Spectrum in line, Euphorics or Hopkick or any water-based one, or using something like the gas hopper. And this was also a question that I didn't get to ask Brian and Philip, which I wish I had. But what if you use, because they were talking about, there's a lot of stuff that remains in the keg, like isovaleric acid doesn't go, that's cheesy. That's one of the stale hop aromas that doesn't go over into the beer. It stays in that hop water that's warm. So I was wondering, could you use, if you've got a whole bunch of hops out in the freezer, can you use those old hops in this gas hopper to pull off the aromatics that you like? I wish I had asked them that question. I didn't. Maybe I'll send that in as feedback and read that in a future episode. But things like that are really interesting ways, that you can deal with a finished beer to add more hops to it, or like you said, layer on additional flavors. So it's super important. But all this sort of goes back to that, component that what we were talking about earlier about survivables, about figuring out what flavors and what aromas you want in your beer, and then what's the best way to get those in. What hop has the most of whatever compound it is that you're specifically looking for, and then how is the best way to use that hop. Right? Where should you put it in? Should you put it in a dry hop? Should you put it in addition to Spectrum? Should you put it in as a dip hop? Or like you found out with Incognito, hey, Incognito works really great if I dip hop with it. And it tastes great and it tastes wonderful and it adds a bunch of complexity. And maybe there's even some biotransformation of some of those hop compounds that happens because you added Incognito. Maybe some biotransformation is happening after fermentation. That might be one of the reasons why you're getting more of the beer in there. But there's so many ways to get hop aroma and keep it in your beer.
And they keep coming out, right? Like YCH just came out with Dynaboost or whatever they're calling it. And I think that might be the one that they're saying that it's made to be flowable and readily added to fermentation. Maybe I'm mixing that up with another forthcoming product from Haas. But that's why we, quote, dip hop Incognito, is it needs heat to go into solution. And so if you were to add the Incognito oil straight to like a quote dry hop cold, it wouldn't. It would just be a glob that sits on top, right? And so, I mean, the Spectrum, you're supposed to mix that with some beer, some deaerated water to introduce that as well. And so there are some dosing challenges with this stuff, and we're kind of like having to find ways to introduce it into the beer given the processes in front of us. And so we're kind of hacking it a little bit, and but gosh darn it, it works.
Yeah, and I'll kind of leave with this thought is that dry hopping is really inefficient. It adds a whole bunch of stuff to beer that's not necessarily wanted. It strips out a bunch of aroma that might have already been present in the beer from other things that you've added into it. To the extent that you can modify dry hopping or maybe add and layer different flavors, there's a lot of opportunity here to improve your IPA, right? So if you find your beer doesn't have the hop aroma, consider something like the gas hopper, or like changing, and using different types of hops, or the times that you add them. I think that stuff is really important. Now, we didn't get time to talk about like cold side oxidation and purging and deaerated water and close transfer, metabisulfites, all those other things that are important for preserving shelf stability. But that gives us something to talk about in later episodes, Jordan. So, but for today, I think we covered enough about getting hop aroma into your beer and keeping it there in terms of survivability and layering flavors.
All right. Well, now as we close out, I'm ready for an IPA.
Yeah, well, I'm sure you have one on tap. And if not, you're in Oregon like me, so we can just go anywhere and get 8. So I'm excited about that. All right. Anything else you wanted to add, Jordan?
No, I love hoppy beer. Excited to talk more about it in the future.
All right. Sounds good. Jordan and I will be back in 2 weeks with our next Applying the Science episode. See y'all then. The Brew Lab is a production of Brülosophy, where they who drink beer think beer. Don't forget to visit Brülosophy.com to read about our weekly experiments and other brewing adventures, and listen to us talk about it on our other show, the Brülosophy Podcast. Thanks to all of our sponsors and patrons that help make this show possible. If you'd like to receive a reward for helping us do what we do, visit patreon.com/Brülosophy to see how you can do just that. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in the Brew Lab with another guest next week. Until then, think beer.
How many times a day do you compare yourself to others? Or wish your life looked like someone else's? We all do it sometimes, because it's easy to envy friends' lives on social media when you only see the good parts. But you know what they say, comparison is the thief of joy. And in reality, nobody has it all together. Online therapy can help you focus on what you want instead of what others have. Like that career goal you've set your sights on, or that relationship you want to grow, or that daily habit you want to get into. Because your best life is always better than the idea of someone else's. BetterHelp makes therapy more accessible and less overwhelming with affordable online sessions that you can do anytime, anywhere. That's why over 4 million people have used it for mental health support. So stop comparing and start living with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com.